Good afternoon. I'm David Oxtoby, President of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and it is my distinct pleasure to call to order the 2092nd Stated Meeting of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Since our founding in 1780, presidents of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences have banged a gavel to begin 2,091 different stated meetings on crucial issues facing our nation. Our archives contain records of meetings on every topic imaginable, from agricultural practices to nuclear disarmament to the new and controversial ideas of Charles Darwin. Since America's infancy, members of the Academy have gathered to discuss and debate the big issues of the day, often during times of tremendous uncertainty for the nation. But they have never held one of these very official convenings online. Today, we are meeting under the extraordinary circumstances of a pandemic in a venue unimaginable to our founders, to engage with an audience more diverse in nearly every way than they could ever have appreciated. Thank you for joining us. Today's program, Does Meritocracy Destroy the Common Good?, is the Morton L. Mandel Public Lecture made possible by the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation. Morton Mandel believed deeply in the work of the Academy, and his generosity helped transform our organization. Among other causes, he was committed to using technology to extend the Academy's reach, which makes this virtual gathering an especially appropriate match for his public lecture series. Our discussion on the role the meritocratic system plays in American culture comes at a crucial period of reflection for our nation and for institutions like the American Academy. The COVID-19 pandemic and the national reckoning on racial justice have, in short succession, ignited essential conversations about nothing less than the foundations of our democracy and our obligations to each other. This period has coincided with the launch of an American Academy report from our Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, titled Our Common Purpose, Reinventing Democracy for the 21st Century. The bipartisan commission began 2 years ago with the understanding that there is a prevailing sense of crisis among the American people, a feeling that has only intensified since we began our work. The report recommends a series of reforms that, taken together, provide a blueprint for achieving empowerment for all, responsive and effective government, and a resilient and healthy civic culture characterized by a shared commitment to one another and our constitutional democracy. I encourage you to seek this report out at the Academy's website, amacad.org/ourcommonpurpose. As a natural next step, the Academy is exploring a future study examining the American dream and pervasive economic inequality. In his new book, The Tyranny of Merit, Michael Sandel writes from a similar understanding that something is fundamentally wrong with our political and social culture. Michael Sandel is professor of political philosophy at Harvard University. He is a prolific thinker who has worked hard to ensure that his work on justice, ethics, democracy, and markets are accessible to as broad an audience as possible. His books include What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, Democracy's Discontent, America in Search of a Public Philosophy, and Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. Michael was elected to the American Academy in 2003. We are so grateful to Michael for joining us this afternoon to lead us in a conversation. He will begin the program with brief remarks, followed by notes of reflection from two other Academy members, Anna Deavere Smith and T.J. Jackson Lears. Anna Deavere Smith is an actress, playwright, author, professor, and the founding director of the Institute on the Arts and Civic Dialogue at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. She's been nominated for 2 Tony Awards for Twilight Los Angeles and was runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize for her play Fires in the Mirror. She's also well known for her work in television and film, including West Wing, Blackish, and Rachel Getting Married. T.J. Jackson Lears is the Board of Governors Professor of History at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. He is a scholar of American culture whose books include Fables of Abundance, A Cultural History of Advertising in America, Something for Nothing, Luck in America, and Rebirth of a Nation, The Making of Modern America. He has held fellowships with the Guggenheim Foundation, the Smithsonian, and the American Council of Learned Societies, among others, and his work regularly appears in popular publications such as the New York Times and the New Republic. I look forward to moderating a discussion with Michael, Anna, and Jackson with the help of your questions. Please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions for the panel. But first, please join me in welcoming Michael Sandel. Michael?
Thank you, David. What an honor it is to be joined by Jackson Lears and Anna Deavere Smith, whom I greatly admire. Jackson, I quote massively in the book. What a remarkable intellectual and cultural and social historian. And Anna is someone with whom I've had a continuing conversation about the arts, civil society, and justice over many, many years. So I'm grateful to both of them. And David, thank you to you. It's really an honor to be participating in this first virtual stated meeting in the history of the Academy. Listening to you make that introduction and bang that gavel, David, made me imagine what it might have been like had John Adams leaned into his Zoom grid and said, "Franklin, we can't hear you. Remember to unmute yourself." Our subject today is meritocracy and whether it corrupts the common good. And I would like to suggest that it does. I'd like to begin with our political condition. We live in a polarized, rancorous political moment. For decades, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, driving us apart. This divide isn't only about inequality. It's also about the attitudes toward winning and losing that came with it. In recent decades, those who landed on top came to believe that their success was their own doing, a measure of their merit, and that those left behind had no one to blame but themselves. Now, this way of thinking about success arises from a seemingly attractive principle. If everyone starts out with an equal chance, those who succeed deserve the rewards their talents bring. This is the heart of the meritocratic ideal. Now, in practice, of course, we fall short. Not everyone has an equal chance to rise. We see this at Ivy League universities, where there are more students from the top 1% of the income scale than from the entire bottom half of the country combined. But the problem isn't only that we fail to live up to the meritocratic principles we proclaim. The ideal itself has a dark side. Meritocracy is corrosive of the common good. It leads to hubris among the winners and humiliation for those who lose out. It encourages the successful to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way. Even as globalization brought deepening inequality and stagnant wages, its proponents offered workers some bracing advice. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to college. What you earn depends on what you learn. You can make it if you try. What these elites failed to see was the insult implicit in this advice. If you didn't go to college, and if you're not flourishing in the new economy, your failure is your fault. This insult fuels the sense of resentment among a great many working people toward meritocratic elites. So what should we do about it? In the book, I discuss a number of things, but what I'd like to raise for our discussion today is that one of the things we need to do is to rethink the role of universities as arbiters of opportunity. Universities have been enlisted in the meritocratic project as a political project. And in many ways, it's enlarged the cultural prestige of higher education. But it's come at a cost, not only to our democracy, but also to the colleges and universities themselves. At least that's what I would like to suggest and see what people think. The meritocratic mission of selective colleges and universities found its clearest expression in the writings of James Conant in the 1940s, president of Harvard. He wanted to overturn the established hereditary elite that he saw dominating not only at Harvard, but also throughout American society. And so, as Nick Lemon tells in his book on the origin of the SAT, Conant wanted a meritocratic society to replace this hereditary privileged one. And in many ways, he succeeded. Today, higher education is far more inclusive than it was back in the 1940s and 50s. More inclusive in terms of gender, race, ethnicity. But what hasn't happened is what Conant expected and wanted, that the new meritocracy would produce a fluid, mobile society. One of the reasons this hasn't happened is that today's credentialed professional classes have figured out how to pass their privileges onto their children, not by bequeathing them large estates, but by equipping them with the advantages that give them a leg up in meritocratic competition. We see this in the class profile of colleges and universities, including ones that have generous financial aid policies. But there's something even more telling, which is colleges and universities in the United States, despite Conant's hope, do not serve as powerful engines of upward mobility. And this was dramatized in the findings by the economist Raj Chetty and a team of colleagues, who recently did a comprehensive study of the role of colleges in promoting intergenerational mobility, looking at the economic trajectory of 30 million college students from 1999 to 2013. And they asked, for each college in the United States, what proportion of students rise from the bottom quintile to the top? How many students, in other words, at this college, what proportion of the students enter having come from poor families and wind up earning enough to put them in the top 20% of earners? And the answer is shockingly few. Although attending a place like Harvard or Princeton or Stanford does give a poor kid a very good chance of rising, such places enroll so few poor kids to begin with that the mobility rate is low. At Harvard, less than 2% of students rise from the bottom to the top of the income scale. At Princeton, it's 1.3. The same is true at some of the big name public universities, at the University of Michigan, University of Virginia. The mobility rate is 1.5%. Taken together, Chetty and his team looked at 1,800 colleges and universities and found that fewer than 2% of their students rise from the bottom fifth to the top fifth of the income scale. So what should we do about higher education if it is not performing the function of upward mobility that Conant and today's defenders of the meritocratic ideal of upward mobility hoped and expected it to do? Well, it seems to me there's another alternative. One alternative is to double down on the meritocratic project and to try to remove the obstacles to poor kids getting in. And so we have debates about legacy admissions, for example, and how to do a better job of recruiting in poor communities. But this approach essentially would solve the problem of meritocracy by making higher education a more perfect meritocracy. But I think we should consider the possibility that the flaw is implicit in the ideal itself. And we see this if we look not only at those who were left out, but also at the wounds that are inflicted on the winners. Because while it's true that affluent parents can pass their advantages on to their kids, the mechanism of their doing so is to subject their kids to such a high pressure, stress-strewn adolescence that by the time these students arrive, here I'm talking about the so-called winners, not those who are excluded. By the time they arrive, they are so accustomed to hoop jumping, so driven to strive, that very often they struggle to find the space and peace to treat their college years as occasions for exploration, figuring out what's worth caring about, what they believe, and why. When Conant set Harvard and higher education the task of testing and sorting the American population, I doubt he imagined the relentless meritocratic competition the project would unleash. But the time has come, I think, to rethink the role of higher education, not only to repair the damaged psyches of the privileged, but also to repair the civic life that meritocratic sorting has produced. The tyranny of merit points in two directions. Toward those who are left out, in whom it induces a sense, a demoralizing sense of failure and exclusion, and also among those who land on top. It induces a kind of anxiety, a debilitating perfectionism, a meritocratic hubris that struggles to conceal a fragile self-esteem. So I think instead of simply trying to perfect the meritocracy, the meritocratic role that higher education performs, we should instead have a new debate about how to disentangle higher education from the mission of meritocratic sorting. This has to do with taking seriously the dignity of work, providing public support and according social esteem to those who make important contributions to our society, though they don't have a college degree, and they are, by the way, a majority of our fellow citizens. Those of us who pass our time in the company of the credentialed can easily forget that nearly 2/3 of Americans do not have a 4-year college degree. So it's a mistake to design an economy that makes a university degree a condition of a dignified life and of decent work. The most potent rival to merit, to the idea that we are responsible for our lot and deserve what we get, is the notion that we are indebted for our success and also for our troubles to the vagaries of fortune, or to the grace of God, or to the luck of the draw. Going back to the Puritans, we have seen the tension, the dialectic between an ethic of grace and an ethic of merit, and Jackson has written powerfully about this. Living by the belief that we have no hand in whether we will be saved in the next world or successful in this one is hard to reconcile with the idea of freedom. And so merit tends perpetually to drive out luck or grace. And sooner or later, the successful assert and come to believe that their success is their own doing. But even in its triumph, the meritocratic faith does not deliver the freedom or the self-mastery it promises, nor does it provide a basis for solidarity. Ungenerous to the losers and oppressive to the winners, merit has become a tyrant. And when it does, we should enlist an ancient rival to rein it in. And that ancient rival requires cultivating a keener appreciation of the role of luck in life. Being alive to the chanced nature of our lot can be conducive to a certain humility. This humility would help our students, but this humility is also the civic virtue most needed in our time. It points beyond the tyranny of merit toward a less rancorous, more generous public life.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now let me invite Jackson Lears to give a response.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks to the Academy for inviting me here, and particularly thanks to Michael for initiating that invitation and for engaging with a book that had slipped into relative obscurity fairly quickly because it was published, as a number of my books seem to be, at the worst possible time. It was the height of the escalation toward the invasion of Iraq, and there was a lot of talk of providential destiny in the air. And my book, as I think Michael has suggested indirectly, posed a challenge to the kind of secular providence that suggests that people get what they deserve in this life, as well as the world to come, if indeed there is one. And I want to talk just for a few minutes about the historical origins of meritocracy, which we have to realize is different from merit per se, even though I appreciate Michael's title and I think it's good in its concision. But when merit becomes meritocracy, then we are dealing with an idea that has become institutionalized as a means for organizing an entire society, but also an ideology that sanctifies its proponent's sense of entitlement to run the nation and maybe even the world. And what I want to suggest is that if we look at both the historical origins of American belief in meritocracy and the historical alternatives, which I can only briefly gesture to, we might have a deeper sense of what we're engaging with and why these issues tend to run so deeply in our national history and in our debates about what we are as a nation. So the belief that people get what they deserve is central to American success mythology. It has been since at least the mid-19th century, if not earlier, and it's based on a very secular version of the Christian faith in providence. The traditional view was the view that God's ways were not our ways, and that those who prosper in the world, in this world, might well fry in the next. No one knew. God's ways were mysterious, if not absolutely opaque to mere human comprehension. But this starts to change and accelerates that change through the 19th century when there's a growing assumption among particularly educated and affluent American Protestants. And you have to recognize this was a predominantly Protestant nation at the time in terms of cultural style and even also in terms of secular values. Assumption among American Protestants that fundamentally began to change was the emergence of the view that God's will could be discovered in human affairs, and that success or failure of individuals, as well as that of nations, could reveal God's will at work in this world. So the American nation was, from this point of view, divinely ordained to play a redemptive role in world history. And since this was a market society, the rich were rich because they deserved to be, and the poor had no one to blame but themselves. The moral dimension here, the distinction that was made between the worthy and the unworthy, the deserving and the undeserving, this survived the transformation of the Protestant ethic into the spirit of capitalism. The assumption that successful people had earned their wealth and failures had frittered away their opportunities through laziness and inattention to business. This was comforting for the successful few. One finds it certainly in the beliefs of people like John D. Rockefeller Sr. and also J.P. Morgan. One's a Baptist, one's an Episcopalian, but they have the same notions of providence. It's very comforting and of course understanding, but it's stigmatizing for the struggling many. At the same time, though, and this is very important, I think, historically, as well as with respect to contemporary affairs, the vision of a nation of autonomous strivers was always counterbalanced by older ideals of community and solidarity, whether they came from religion or family or community traditions and customs. And these were cultural memories and also current realities for many people. This sense of community and solidarity. The socialists in the late 19th century, democratic socialists, talked about building a cooperative commonwealth. Progressive reformers talked about bringing commonwealth to bear against wealth. And these kinds of sentiments animated populist and socialists and progressive movements, and then resurfaced in the Great Depression to become the basis, however limited and imperfect, especially with respect to gender and race, it became the basis of mid-century social democracy. Now, in the last 4 decades or so, as Michael points out, with the rise of what I think we can fairly call neoliberal capitalism, the autonomous self has returned to the center of the success ethic. The autonomous self is more autonomous than ever, more bereft of communal supports, more responsible for his or her own fate, down to and including the metrics of personal health, which the responsible individual is now expected to monitor as anxiously as the Calvinist monitored the contents of his soul. So the idioms have changed since the 19th century. There's less emphasis on plodding diligence. There's more on talent, brains, and credentialed expertise. But the lack of success now implies not only a failure of mental power, but still a failure of moral character. There's still that sting of moral judgment about it. And the impact on democratic fellow feeling, as Michael shows, I think very convincingly in his book, has been even more devastating in this recent Gilded Age than it was in the last one, more than a century ago. So I want to echo what Michael suggested and say that we need to resurrect the tradition that I explore in my book, Something for Nothing, which emphasized the centrality of chance in human affairs and an acknowledgement of the centrality of chance in human affairs does make a huge difference in how we tend to relate to one another, how we tend to evaluate one another's worth in the world. And it also introduces a sense of humility. This is not a point of view that is restricted to gamblers and confidence men, although they sometimes benefited from it. There is a whole underside of American culture pushed to the margins much of the time by dominant cultural elites, but nevertheless thriving and acknowledging the role of chance, which of course has a long pedigree. We can go back at least to the wisdom of Ecclesiastes to acknowledge the ubiquity of hazard in human affairs and recognize that you don't always get what you deserve. You get what you get.
Thank you, Jackson. Let me invite Anna DeVere Smith to say a few words in response as well.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jackson. You get what you get. Okay, so everybody can hear me. The land of smoke and mirrors, in the land of smoke and mirrors, there's a real hotel, which I'll call the Hotel Merit Hollywood. Just a quarter block south and a half a block west of one of the busiest intersections in all of Southern California, it has a facade of quiet opulence. The semicircular driveway is adorned from around 8 a.m. until dusk with a Lamborghini, a McLaren, a Bentley, and a house car is a Rolls. The entertainment industry movers and shakers do breakfast, lunch, and cocktails there. Breakfast costing around $100 for 2 people, even though the shakers don't really eat very much. They're quite fit. Sprinting up and down the meritocratic ladder is done without breaking much of a sweat, no matter how far apart the rungs are. Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, et al. Don't always appear on the resumes of the elite here. To be sure, there's a healthy contingent of alums, but the only necessary credential to have your special table at the Hotel Merit poolside is the ability to make money and or noise, meaning to attract attention. Helps to have a couple movie stars in your pantry to leverage. Those in power at the Merit seek to be Michael, to use the words you've pulled from the liberal speak thesaurus, on the right side of history. One of the most powerful agencies in town, extending to offices in 14 cities and 6 nations, represents the founders of Black Lives Matter. Here comes the main character of this part of my tale. It was dusk in the parking lot at the Hotel Marriott Hollywood. I was waiting for my rental car, not a Lamborghini. My breath was arrested by a standard poodle. She, I think it was a she, was poodle royalty, well-bred, racehorse legs, not a silly haircut, groomed with taste. Taste, now there's a word they throw around at the Marriott, taste. She was obviously well-educated, tutored daily. I did not sense hubris, Michael. Her intelligence came through a piercing, focused gaze. Every ringlet of her thick coat fell, as it should. A beautiful jeweled collar, maybe fake jewels, but you never know. It's the land of excess, where even a dog's sense of self depends on a little bit of bling. She wouldn't last in the dog park, though. Even her deep desire to play with others probably wouldn't come forward. I suspect that if her nanny didn't rescue her immediately, she'd escape on her own. She was not bred to cavort. All she was bred for is to look like $1 million. She knew her worth. There's an apartment building, I'll call it the Tudor Downs, that is situated in New Haven, where there's Yale, and then there's everybody else. The Downs is a beat up place that's in everybody else's part of town. I and my collaborators were boarded there while we were rehearsing Let Me Down Easy, my 2008 play about resilience and vulnerability, the body versus American healthcare, the body versus the state, life versus death, winning versus losing. Michael, you know all about that play because you were among the real people that I interviewed and portrayed in the New Haven version. Many who work with me on my plays, in fact, did attend Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, but they don't have a lot of hubris, Michael. And that's because of money. For example, after doing research in 3 continents, writing several drafts of the play, and being its sole performer 8 shows a week, no understudy, my compensation in 2008, if I recall, was about $700 a week, plus a small fraction of proceeds from ticket sales. Directors, designers, the same range. Those of us who work in nonprofit theater aren't there for the money. Whereas the salaries of resident artistic and managing directors pre-COVID increased exponentially over the last 3 decades, the salaries of we, the itinerant artists, have not. Those in consistent power, including our unions perhaps, are banking on an assumption that we who are skilled performers, directors, writers, designers, assistants, choose to work in nonprofit institutions because we have something burning in our hearts to say, and having the opportunity to say it ought to be pay enough. Some of us buy into the missions of these theaters, creating community, the betterment of society, maybe even the common good, etc. But here's the relevant action of this part of my presentation. Memphis, my dog, lived with me for 17 years, but it was not until our 7th year together during our sojourn at the Tudor Downs that I learned of her gifts. The realization was, to use your words, Professor Sandel, from that interview I did of you in 2007, unbidden. The realization was unbidden. Memphis had no pedigree. The vet said that she was part Australian cattle dog, other part anybody's guest. She was not educated, and that's my fault. She was like the rest of her breed, smarter than human, a half of her breed at least. She was smarter than me. So even as she showed great potential at puppy school, I flunked out. And as you know, the owner, or as they say, the parent of the dog, has to get trained as well. With my dismissal came hers. A fire alarm went off at the Downs in the middle of the day. Our rooms were on maybe the 18th floor. People I'd never seen, some of them in pajamas, poured out of rooms into the hallways and down the stairs. Much to my horror, as we ran down the stairs, Memphis ran back up the many floors. Australian cattle dogs are herders, and her herding DNA revealed itself for the first time. Never trained to herd, but she had dignity about the work that she was bred to do. No matter how many times I screamed for her to come with me, singular me, her owner, she herded everybody else, previously unknown to her, out of the building with resolve and the utmost purpose. I guess Memphis understood the common good and it prevailed. I will close with some words from the 2007 interview I conducted of Michael, and for which my portrait of him in Let Me Down Easy, New Haven was based. I will not perform him now, but here's one of my favorite parts that was in the play. And it's relevant to our discussion about the tyranny of merit. I quote Professor Sandel. In the 20s and 30s, there were state fairs that awarded prizes called fittest family prizes. You would go to the state fair, and alongside the livestock competitions where they would give blue ribbons to the best cattle or the best bred pig, they were doing the same for human beings. And people would enter and they would give their genetic information, their medical history, and they would award prizes for the fittest families, just as they gave gold medals to the fittest cattle and the best bred pig. And what we're doing today in the name of helping our children, equipping our children, we are gradually, without being aware of it, turning parenting into manufacturing as if the child were a consumer good. We're using technologies to fit ourselves into the world that happens to be. We should change society to fit us rather than to try to change our bodies to fit the social roles that could be otherwise. It is a lack of moral imagination. The tyranny of merit raises so many important questions, and as others had said, it's the perfect time to have that book. One of my questions is, how much of our instinct towards the common good has been bred out of us? Or is it still there? That's what the Hopeaholics would say. Like Memphis's herding. She was an orphan dog found on the side of a highway in Tennessee, probably because I'm told she proved as a puppy to be gun shy. There were no papers to document her aptitude, but her herding instinct emerged once the need was really there on that staircase in the Downs. What skill sets do we have that we don't even know about because we've not practiced? Or, more troubling, because we are numb to the needs around us? Have we lost our instinct to protect the common good?
Thank you, Anna. So now we'll turn to a conversation with Michael with his two respondents. Let me actually begin by inviting Michael, if you have any quick responses to what Anna and Jackson have just said.
Well, these are magnificent responses, and I would like to identify one theme that I think connects them, and that also is, in a way, the animating purpose of my book, The Tyranny of Merit. Underlying all of these debates about success and moral desert, who deserves what, and about winners and losers, and about rising, is a question about human freedom and about the human person. Jackson raised this when he pointed out in his earlier book, from which I learned a great deal, the parallel between the earlier Christian debate about whether salvation is something we earn through our own merit or something that is an unearned gift. Anna raised it with this actually quite deep story about her dog Merit, a mutt, an unbidden dog who was not deliberately created, crafted, honed, designed, but just happened to be. And in happening to be, turned out to have the impulse to the common good that Anna wonders about today, whether we've lost our capacity for it or whether it's simply occluded. So what strikes me about both Jackson and Anna's really far-reaching observations is the question that I most care about in this book, and it does go back, Anna's right, to an earlier book I wrote about designer children and eugenics. There is something alluring about a conception of freedom that enables us to say and to believe that we are self-making, that we are human agents to so thoroughgoing an extent that we are the masters of our nature and the masters of our lot in life, that we are wholly responsible for where we land, whether we're saved, whether we're rich. And what the tyranny of merit, the moral of the story of the tyranny of merit is that alluring image of self-mastery and self-making is flawed. It's a flawed conception of freedom. It doesn't lead to a satisfying way of life, and it disparages the rest, cuts us off from a sense of responsibility for those less fortunate than ourselves. So that seems to me the deep point that Jackson and Anna have identified, and that really is the ultimate question at stake, the ultimate moral, even existential, theological question at stake in the debate about meritocracy.
Thank you. Further comments, Anna, Jackson, the discussion here. Well, we have about 10 minutes or so for a discussion with the three of you, and then we'll invite, we have some questions already coming in on the Q&A from and chat from the audience.
I want to make a quick comment on eugenics, because I think it's very important that both Anna and Michael brought that up. It seems to me there is a kind of stealth operation going on. As you all know, eugenics went out of fashion during the Second World War and since, because it was associated with Nazism and fascist regimes generally and organized racism. But we have seen in recent decades, we've seen a revival of an updated version of 19th century liberal individualist laissez-faire economics on the one hand, free market rhetoric and so on, however inaccurate it is with respect to the actual workings of the economy. It has become all the rage, the whole emphasis on free entrepreneurship and innovation, and the sense that creative destruction has come back into fashion as a term of approbation, almost with a kind of providential dimension to it, so that no matter how many factories have been closed and communities have been hollowed out and lives have been destroyed, this is all just part of the creative destruction that is necessary to foster further innovation. So it's almost as if it plays a kind of secular providentialist role in justifying untrammeled capitalism. So that's one point of view that's come back into fashion that one associates with the late 19th century, but another is a kind of positivist scientism that argues that science has answered or is about to answer all ultimate questions about human worth and human purpose, and that one can therefore look to science, however that may be defined, to define human worth, to define the fittest. And the ideology of meritocracy basically says, we, the meritorious ones who have been recognized as such by the meritocracy, are the most fit. We are entitled to our privileges because we are the fittest. So there's a kind of revival of a kind of social Darwinist, and of course there is a lot of pop Darwinian flavor to that idiom as well. But there's a certain sense in which the fittest, as Michael points out, in the meritocratic scheme of things, have a renewed claim on power and respect and influence. And there's less embarrassment about using that kind of language, it seems to me, than there used to be. So that in my way of thinking, there's a connection between neoliberal political economy and positivist social science, often with a kind of eugenic or neo-Darwinian flavor.
I have a question actually for Michael, and that is, you often use the word in the book deliberate, and talk about how we need to deliberate about our values, and I want to know where you see some of those spaces, or how that would work, or if you think it's working now.
I think it's not working now. And
where you find it working?
Well, in the conversations after some of your performances, but these are spaces we need to proliferate and enlarge. I think the reason the reason we desperately need occasions and sites and spaces for deliberation is that in their absence, we allow merit to be defined by the money people make in a market. And it's easy to slide into the assumption that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good, subject to some assumptions about markets being truly competitive and so on. That's an easy assumption to make, but it's a mistake. In a way, I think that what I'm arguing against is not merit as such, but merit as defined by the rewards markets bestow on the talents the society happens to prize at any given moment. LeBron James is a great basketball player. And of course, he works hard to develop his talents. But it's not his doing that he happens to live in a society that loves basketball. That's his good luck. If he had lived in the Renaissance, when they cared more about fresco painters than NBA players, he wouldn't enjoy the bounty the market heaps on his talents now. So what we need to do, I think, is to find occasions to deliberate about what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good and how it should be rewarded, both in material terms, but also in terms of social recognition and esteem. These are judgments that we have been outsourcing implicitly to markets, especially during the last 4 decades of kind of market triumphalist faith. But the only way of reining that in, of taking responsibility on ourselves as citizens for reflecting on what counts, what should count, and be recognized as a valuable contribution to the common good, is to deliberate. One moment, and this comes in moments, one possible moment for this kind of deliberation is now in the midst of the pandemic, when we suddenly are referring to delivery people and warehouse workers and grocery store clerks and home health care providers as essential workers. And yet these are not the best paid or most honored members of our society. So at least there's a moment of dissonance. And that moment of dissonance could be an occasion for deliberation, Anna, about what contributions really are worthy of honor, recognition, and award. and reward, and how can we reconfigure our economy to take account of those judgments? What do you think?
Well, my one concern about the deliberation is how segregated our society remains.
Yeah,
The only place to have it is in social media, right? Because even theaters attract certain kinds of people and not others. And I don't even believe in all the stuff about, let's give people have other things to do. Think
Yeah.
other ways to spend their time. It's not just about money or stuff like that. And you've already talked about, what your classroom is like, what mine is like at NYU. So I love the image in your book of the, you're referring to another writer who gives an image of the Library of Congress, of all these different kinds of people, the laborer, all these kinds of people in one place. I meant to try to check and see if anything like that happens in the Library of Congress right now. I kind of don't think so.
right. And what that suggests is that part of the crisis of deliberation and of the common good is that we lack class mixing common spaces in public places, especially those, libraries are a good example, where people come together in the ordinary course of life for other purposes, but find that they encounter people from different walks of life, different backgrounds of class and race and ethnicity and life experience. In the course of their everyday lives, it used to be that sports stadia were class mixing institutions. Back when I was a kid going to watch in Minnesota my favorite baseball team play, there were CEOs and mailroom clerks who sat more or less side by side, who all got rained on, got wet when it rained. But then through the 90s and 2000s, most stadia had VIP skyboxes. So even places that were once occasions for inadvertent mixing have been segmented or segregated. And those who can afford to buy their way out of public services, cultural institutions, recreational facilities, for public transit have done so. And so but part of this project would require reinventing the civic infrastructure of a shared common life, places where inadvertent, unplanned encounters can take place. These can be the seedbeds of civic deliberation.
I like your phrase. I think it was your phrase, Michael. It's certainly when I've read and picked up various places, fellow feeling. I think fellow feeling is what needs somehow to be generated, and I don't think it's that creating the kind of public spaces you describe is essential to that, obviously, but it doesn't guarantee anything.
Right.
Anything we can hope will come out of it, but it's a little less than solidarity. It's a little less rigorous and demanding, but it's the source, it seems to me. We're talking about human sympathy. We're talking about a sense that we're all in this together. If we can't generate that now in the midst of the pandemic, can we? That's the question.
Let me jump in. We have several hundred participants, and a number of you have been asking questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, of course, but I would like to bring some of the audience questions in. And first of all, a fairly quick question for you, Michael. A couple of people, Greg Nadeau and Jim Kloppenberg, have both asked about the possible role, say for Harvard, of using randomness in admitting students. And I know you do talk about that in your book, so you might just mention briefly what your proposal is in that area.
Right. I do make what some may consider an inflammatory proposal in the book, which is that places, that selective universities that have far more applicants, qualified applicants, than they can possibly accept, should do the following. I mean, Harvard and Stanford get over 40,000 applicants for around 2,000 places. Most of them, so the admissions officers tell us, are well qualified to do the work and to contribute to the classroom experience for their fellow students. So I suggest the following. Let the admissions office cull out those who are not well qualified to do the work and do it well. So that would reduce the number from 40,000 to, I don't know, 25,000 maybe, or 30,000 or 20,000. Then, instead of undertaking fine-grained judgments about how to choose from those 20 or 25,000, have a lottery. I call it a lottery of the qualified. My hunch is that the quality of the classroom discussion in my class and ours would go just as well. And insofar as we're concerned about ensuring diversity, that can be included within the lottery, either by giving members of groups we want to make sure are represented extra lottery tickets, or admitting, let's say, a certain number of groups, say first-generation students, before running the lottery. But the idea of the lottery is mainly, it's an educational device to teach the students who enter that their admission is not all their own doing, but a matter of luck, as it would be under the explicit lottery system, but as it is anyhow, even when we pretend otherwise. So this is a proposal, David, that may get me into a lot of trouble, but this is one modest proposal to change the attitudes surrounding winning and losing.
So then a follow-up question, which actually posed in part by Graham Allison, which we spoke about briefly last week, is the American Academy, of course, entrance into the Academy is based, we say, on merit. Would you be in favor of introducing an element of chance or randomness in the election process for the American Academy? I'll actually address that to all three of our panelists.
All right, well, let's see, let the other, Jackson and Anna, speak about that first, and then I'll.
Jackson, it's on you.
Well, I actually think, I mean, this is a shooting from the hip here, obviously, but I think Michael's description of the admissions process at Harvard and Stanford and the number of qualified people who are turned away through happenstance applies to a certain extent to the academy, I would think, as well. There is no there is no foolproof guarantee that all of the decisions will reflect that are made by this organization will acknowledge and will find the truly meritorious among us. And I'm reminded of I think it was Keats or Shelley, I'm not sure, it was one of those guys, full many a flower is born to bloom unseen. I'm reminded of the number of truly brilliant people who are working away in sometimes rather obscure and certainly not that prestigious academic environments. They're brilliant people everywhere, but they don't come to the attention of the meritocratic elite, and to the extent the academy is part of that, they don't come to the academy's attention as easily as people from Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Yale, and so forth. So there might actually be something to that, to loosen things up a little and to complicate or expand the kinds of institutions that are represented in this academy and embodied in its membership. I would say that it's a modest proposal that could use some discussion at least.
Anna, any thoughts yourself?
I just want to point out that I noticed in the chat that Jillian has suggested that the lottery idea, at least for schools, wouldn't be very good for endowments. Although, in terms of the academy, it's my sense, though, that something's afoot there, right? I mean, I came in this last year's class, and looks like it's a very diverse class. I don't know if it's always been that diverse before. So has there been adjustments in the way the process has worked already?
There's been a concerted effort to increase the diversity of the Academy membership. No question about it. And it really starts with nominations. I mean, we really need a broad range of nominations so that the election process can be a very thorough one and very diverse. But we have made progress the last several years. So let me pose a question that came from Jen Shu, who asks, how is American individualism different from similar meritocratic beliefs across other cultures and countries worldwide? And what frameworks can help us understand the US? Is this Protestant work ethic a US phenomenon, or how is the US different from other socio-political systems?
Surveys find that Americans, much more than Europeans, believe that effort and hard work are important to success, to getting ahead. And the surveys find that in Europe, there is a far greater tendency to believe that other factors, including luck, determine who gets ahead. It's also interesting, the faith, the belief in social mobility. In the United States, the chance of rising one generation to the next, from the bottom to the top, is actually quite small. Only about 5 to 8% of those born in the bottom fifth wind up as adults in the top. And yet Americans believe the chance of rising is much greater. And Europeans, where upward mobility rates are actually, for the most part, higher than in the US. In Europe, people tend to believe that the chance of rising is less than it is. And this may account in part for the more generous welfare state in European countries than Americans have been able to muster. And it also bears on the debate about meritocracy, although the meritocratic political project that has gone hand in hand with a kind of market-driven globalization in the last 4 decades has found expression certainly in Britain, along with the United States, and to a lesser extent in other European countries.
Thank you. Here's a question from Alfred Spector. No one disagrees that our meritocracy is imperfect, and you've brought up some of the problems. What would you really do about it? In particular, Alfred suggests that there are 2 things that you could try to do. One is to reduce the gain on merit, in other words, the relative impact of range of salary, et cetera. Or would you actually try to make people more equal in some way? So have differences but reduce the impact, or try to just make people more equal in some way?
It's often thought that the 2 alternatives are either equality of opportunity, which we've been talking about implicitly in discussing merit and rising and upward mobility, equality of opportunity, or equality of result, where everyone must have the same income and wealth. But those are not the only 2 alternatives. A third alternative, and one that I would favor, though it requires working out, is equality of condition, or democratic condition, which is not mainly about mobility, the ability of an individual to rise from the class of his or her birth, nor is it about trying to ensure that everyone has a kind of leveling equality, same income and wealth. It goes back to what we were discussing earlier about creating public spaces and common institutions that enable people to deliberate, to look one another in the eye as equal citizens. It's a kind of equal standing. It's about mutual respect. It's about a democratic recognition, the kind of recognition that we lack when we have the condition as today when those on top believe they've earned their place, those at the bottom deserve their place as well. And this is what 19th century visitors to America were struck by. Not equality of opportunity understood as mobility or equal income and wealth, but a broad equality of condition, where people could stand on their own 2 feet with a sense of independence, be informed, broadly informed about public affairs, have access to the major sources of learning throughout the society. That's one of the things we've lost when we've sequestered learning in higher education and then debated about how to create equal access to the citadel. The alternative is to ask a different question. How can we diffuse learning so that everyone, regardless of whether or not he or she has gone to a university or to an apprenticeship program, regardless of their the work they do, can have access to the basic sources of learning and cultural enrichment. This is what I mean by a democratic equality of condition that gets beyond the debate between equality of opportunity and equality of result.
So there's a couple of questions about the universities that you've been talking about. Alex Lovett points out that the critics of merit have been emerging from elite institutions. Daniel Markovits from Yale, Lani Guinier, Anthony Carnival wrote from Georgetown about the merit myth. So why elite institutions, and are the elite faculty at the pinnacle of the hierarchy best positioned to dismantle the system? And then a parallel question Naomi Oreskes asks about why you haven't spoken so much, not just about the flagships like University of Michigan, but what about community colleges and the whole range of higher education? It seems to be a focus just on the very pinnacle and not on the range of education.
Well, to take Naomi's question first, in the book, part of what I'm calling for is a greater emphasis and investment, and also a greater honoring of community colleges and forms of education and learning that equip actually most Americans to acquire the skills and also cultivate the outlook that they bring to their communities and to American democracy. So I agree very much that there should be a shift from part of what I'm arguing against, and perhaps this is why I've focused on it here, is the tendency over the last few decades to concentrate resources and investment, and above all, prestige in name brand, highly selective universities. I don't think this has served education well. I don't think it's neglected community colleges and other forms of technical and vocational training. But I don't even think it has served the apparent beneficiaries, the highly endowed, highly prestigious colleges and universities well, because their mission, their sorting mission, this is the devil's bargain. In exchange for that prestige and cultural centrality, in exchange for having everyone clamoring from the affluent classes to get their kids in, the sorting function of these institutions has come to crowd out our educational function. And so for the sake of the integrity of the educational mission, that is our primary vocation, I think there is a corrupting influence, even if you put aside inequality, even if you put aside lack of adequate recognition and appreciation for the 2/3 of Americans who don't have a four-year college degree. I think the integrity of higher education, these selective universities, is undermined when the frenzied sorting mission becomes so dominant. And I see this in my students. I see this in the broader self-understanding of these universities.
Thank you. I think, unfortunately, our time is really up. I'm going to ask one last question and direct it both to you, Michael, but also to Anna. And that is from Marjorie Perloff. And it says, why do you assume that meritocracy depends entirely on income earned? Many of us relate meritocracy to intellectual or artistic success. Great poets never earn much money, but that's who she thinks of as meritocracy. And Anna referred to that a little bit as well, but maybe you could just comment on that.
Anna, you spoke directly to this, Anna. Do you want to say a word about this?
I think it's really, I think in your book, you make a case that it's more and more about money earned, right? And you talk more about the finance businesses. I mean, I don't think it's about money earned. I think it's about chance as well as choices that people make, at least in the arts, right? I have to work in the movies to subsidize my work in the theater, where I probably don't make minimum wage. So I don't think this is all about money.
Let me a quick question to you, Anna, and this can be my this question can be my, I suppose, last comment, David. Do you consider, when you think of your artistic gift, Anna, do you think that that's something you earned or something that you've discovered and come upon, encountered?
Look, I don't think I'd be sitting here with you today. It doesn't matter. I mean, I've been working on the way I work since 1974. But I wouldn't be sitting here and talking to you today if it weren't for the Los Angeles riots. That had happened at a play of mine in New York that every single designer around the table, except for one, said nobody's going to care about this play because it's about race. Nobody cares about it. That was in and I happened to, my first performance to be on the night of the Los Angeles riots. So people did care about race. And there was this window, like now, very brief window, where my work appeared to be relevant. I completely believe in chance and luck and all that other stuff. And it's not, especially in my profession, it's not just hard work at all.
So,
Jackson?
Excuse me for making one final comment here, and that is on the question of invisibility. It seems to me we have known for decades and generations about the invisibility that is due to gender and race exclusion, and that of course continues. But we also have a larger category of the invisible, who might be characterized as the unlucky. And this is, it seems to me, what we're gesturing toward, the people who are left out by this process of meritocratic sorting. It occurred to me when I was thinking about that quote too, that I have accumulated at least one demerit here today, and that's by misquoting not Keats or Shelley, but Thomas Gray. It was, full many a flower is born to blush unseen, not bloom. So I still hold to that, the sentiment behind that, and I think that loosening up the meritocracy would actually allow for a kind of efflorescence, a flowering of talent in places that and recognition of it in places that we might never have imagined it would appear.
Thank you. There are, of course, many additional questions that we've not been able to pose to the panelists, and quite a chat going with the message board too. But thank you all for being engaged. I want to especially thank Michael, Anna, and Jackson for thoughtful contributions, and thank all of you for taking part. And I hereby dissolve the 2092nd meeting of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences.